Excellent.
Leroy, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Absolute pleasure to meet you too, sir. Absolutely pleasure. The first interview,
Wow.
proper
Well,
interview. Yeah.
I'm honored. What can I say? Uh, let's talk about horror movies because this genre is getting reinvented all the time. And The Last Rite is certainly one of those. Were you a fan of horror films growing up?
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up, I guess you could say, more in the 80s style of horror. So like films like The Thing, Shining was awesome. Amityville Horror has got a special place in my heart. The second one, I found that a very interesting story. One that people probably find now more of a slower burn, but I just love the fact that you get to sort of explore the realm of supernatural through characters that are afflicted by something. I just love that. So yeah.
That's it. Being slightly older, I grew up with a lot of the Hammer films, the kind of schlocky horror movies that were out in the '60s and the '70s. And I think you're right. I think in the '80s, horror kind of came back to really being intelligent and smart and knowing exactly how to manipulate an audience that Hitchcock was doing in the '30s.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at like films of obviously every era, I guess if you go through like the beginning of time where you had the Cabinet of Caligari, and you had all of these different films that started in the silent era that moved through, as you sort of go through, I guess, time in life, you start to realize that ultimately horror predominantly is always recycled. You sort of find that there's cyclical events that sort of happen, be that in the world or be that in the status quo. So when you had the boom of like the POV movies, which were like, I guess, at the end of the 90s,
Yeah, those lost
99.
footage films, yeah,
Yeah.
or found footage.
Yeah, so you had those films that, like, I guess pulled you in for a minute, then they go, then the supernatural comes back, then that goes, and then the zombie genre surfaces again, then that goes. But I think ultimately for me, what happens sort of in horror, you tend to find that you express a personal point of view a lot as a filmmaker, and as a storyteller. You get to explore, the world that sometimes, bad stuff does happen to quite nice and good people. And I guess it's a way for people to vent by watching, from the safety of their own home or a cinema, those types of
The
movies.
reason I think people ride roller coasters is, there's a certain thrill to it, but you're safe, kind of, unless you're riding a roller coaster in China and then anything
Oh,
can happen. Um,
don't do that.
yeah, I know. But tell me, I mean, in The Last Rite, you also play homage to noir films. Your use of light and shadow is really impeccable.
Oh, thank you. I mean, it was a big undertaking to do it because predominantly from the production side of it, it was a minimal crew, minimalistic style of film that was just thriving on the love of movies. So for me, light and dark is a massive part of my ethos when it comes to writing, just the same as it comes to like my directing style, because I think that light loses its relevance without darkness, and it's very relevant like that in the world. If you look at good and bad and evil and all that, I think light plays a massive part on that storytelling, I guess, aid. So for me, it was very much about trying to utilize with the best of our abilities, with the smaller team as we had, the light, utilizing the lack of light, and trying to replicate, I guess you could say, part of the story and its evil presence in a light format. So a lot of the light in the night of The Last Rite ultimately has a sort of greenish tint to it that gradually gets worse as you go through the movie, insinuating that the horror is always present.
Yeah,
um
you really use that really well, and it's also, it's not a foreshadowing tool, but it really kind of gets the audience nervous and involved in what's happening with the characters. You are the writer of Last Rite as well. Where did you come up with the idea? Was it something that had always been in your head?
Well, the last Rite, weirdly, is something that I'm quite, I guess you could say there's an area of the film that looks at, I should say, sleep paralysis and night terrors quite closely. The film isn't just about that. The film's about a lot more than that, but there's part of the story that has some of, let's shall we say, for want of a better word, my own personal experiences chucked in there. So as someone who used to suffer from night terrors and sleep paralysis, it's not the nicest thing to experience for sure. Maybe some of your audience will end up going, oh yeah, I know what it's like to experience that. But I wanted to tell something as a story that stays quite true to what it's like going through part of the experience of it, because for a lot of the time, if you've had an odd experience of some sort, something can't explain, you ultimately run the risk, especially when you tell someone about that. A lot of people don't tend to want to believe you. They go, oh, you're just dreaming. Oh, it was just this. It was just that. It could have been anything. But for you as the person who's going through the experience, it's quite traumatic. So what I wanted to do with The Last Rite was try and aim to tell a vibe of a story that sits in that world where sleep paralysis is a thing, demonic possession is a thing, and shadow figures is a thing. Mm-hmm. Real life case studies in this world, multiple tons of them, and use elements of that into the story, but with its own spin on the story. So I guess you could say it's inspired by true events, but it's not a true story.
It's woven very well, between all of that, and kudos, because writing and directing your own piece, is ultimately suicide for a lot of people, but you've managed to really, I guess understanding that piece is important, and nobody understands it like you. Was casting hard? Because you've got a great cast.
Yeah, I mean, casting was an interesting part of the process, because I think, Lucy, who was played by Bethan Waller, a fabulous actress, she like literally came out of nowhere like a diamond in the rough. And I see so much potential in the UK scene. There's a lot of talented actors and actresses that, all rightfully so, could have probably played this part, but there was something very specific that I was quite looking for. But it was one of those things where I didn't quite know what it was, but I knew what it was when I see it. So, we've done a various amount of castings. Some roles we cast very quick. Others we had to do a little bit more digging for. So the father, the priest, we had to go through quite a lot of different individuals to find him. But the main lead, Lucy, she again played by Bethan Waller. She literally like came into the audition, and it wasn't really the audition itself. It was the preparation for the audition that actually had me sold on her, because we had two parts of the audition. One where it was like the dialogue and playing a bit like possessed. And then another part was actually going through the movement and transformation of being possessed and going through what it's like for someone's body to contort and go through different elements of that. And before she was doing it, she was like stretching, warming up and all of that. And I was like, I love that, because it showed how professional that individual was, who was looking at their work where they're warming up and stretching before they even get to do anything. I thought that was fabulous. So, yeah, so the casting was a good process.
It really was. And I want to thank you for your time this morning. In our last little bit that we have, what do you think audiences are going to take away from watching The Last Rite?
I think ultimately audiences are going to see a film that is relatively true to, I guess you could say, the ethos of what horror films and movies is ultimately birthed in and about. It's not a movie that's littered with jump scares. I made conscious decision to not do that, because I find films that do a lot of that tend to just have that and that alone. Whereas like if somebody watches it a couple of times through, the goal is really for someone to take away from it like, oh, I didn't see that before, that part there, because there's a lot of subtext in the way it's laid out. I've paid homage to quite a few movies in there. Poltergeist is one, Exorcist is another one. Even a tiny bit of like, there's like moments of tension where I've used elements of it. Tiny bit of Hitchcock in there. So yeah, hopefully the audience get to see my idea and see it come to life.
Well, I think they will. I think you have this incredible amount of people that just love horror movies and good ones, and I think they're going to enjoy this film. It's just really really well put together, and your build slow to boil, that kind of thing. It's tension filled. So I do want to thank you and congratulate you again. The Last Rite. Where can we catch it?
So The Last Rite at the moment is looking to be streaming in the US and Canada 26th of November. As of yet, I'm not too sure what platforms it's going to be landing on, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be across most of the major ones out there, because I think your system's a bit different to ours here. We've pretty much got Amazon and Netflix. I think you guys have got a few other ones. But yeah, and also like you can catch The Last Rite movie on our Instagram and our YouTube channels and all of that. So if you just literally Google The Last Rite,
Leroy, it's a pleasure to meet you. And again, congratulations.
Likewise, sir. Absolute pleasure, mate. Thank you very much.